But, one thing also is that a lot of the statutes are honestly outdated and need to be modernized. That's, part of the reason why it's called modernizing the EPA.
My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, we're going to be talking about reforming the EPA, and we aim to delve into how the Environmental Protection Agency lost its way, unfairly targeting oil and gas, and is now being reformed by President Trump. My guest today is Daren Bakst. He's the director of the Competitive Enterprise Institute Center for Energy and Environment. Great to have you on the show today, Daren. Well, Daren, it's great to have you on the show again.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So anyway, I hear you got a new book. Can you tell us a little bit about it? And
Yeah, here it is.
Oh, okay, great.
I don't know if that's the wrong direction or not, but yeah, it's a really big book. It's thick. It's a book called Modernizing the EPA, a Blueprint for Congress. And we've been working on this for over a year with a lot of different people. It is our effort to provide some specific concrete recommendations for Congress on how to reform the EPA. And hopefully a lot of the ideas in it can actually be used by the administration as well. The EPA, the cost of the regulations by the EPA account for more than half of the regulations across the entire federal government. There's just one little agency really that has this major regulatory effect on all of our lives. That's just the cost component, but that doesn't really tell the whole picture. The rules that we're seeing from the EPA are basically controlling the way we live our lives, telling us what kind of cars we can drive, how we can produce our electricity. And it's just far more sweeping than I think Congress ever imagined when they created the EPA in the 1970s. So this book covers the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, pretty much everything you can imagine. And we really hope to turn these ideas into legislation.
Yeah, I always say that, the EPA is kind of the strong arm of the government, right? I mean, the politicians can get up and say, we're not going to touch that. But behind the scenes, the EPA, they turn them loose on it. And, it's just a mess.
It is a mess. And I mean, one problem is that the EPA often ignores the will of Congress. So it just does its thing. But, one thing also is that a lot of the statutes are honestly outdated and need to be modernized. That's, part of the reason why it's called modernizing the EPA. In the 70s, they were worried that the EPA wasn't going to actually issue the regulations necessary to get things done. They set things up in a kind of a precautionary principle approach where it was very risk averse. So they wanted the agency to issue regulations regardless of the costs that were involved. Well, in 2025, the last thing we're worried about is the EPA not issuing regulations or not enough. They're issuing far too many. And, when you issue regulations to adjust our pollutant back in the 1970s, the scope or the effect of it was not going to be as big as it is now, where when you're dealing with regulations on greenhouse gases, for example, to regulate greenhouse gases is the ability to basically regulate the entire economy. And you combine that with the fact that in many instances, the agency doesn't even have to consider costs, then the agency is basically in a position where they can do almost anything. The scope and the effect of it is just so vast that we have to provide some type of controls or limits on what the agency can do.
Was that the original purpose of the EPA when it was originally formed?
Well, the purpose certainly had nothing to do with greenhouse gases. The purpose was, well, the truth is the EPA was formed by some reorganization plan by Nixon. There's not like this bill or statutory language that has very clear authorization language for the EPA. So it's kind of even hard to it's not language I can even point to say what the purpose of the EPA was according to Congress. It's kind of developed through the different statutes that were created. So the Clean Air Act talks about the EPA and the Clean Water Act does. And the focus, though, was on really core environmental issues, addressing tangible harms, environmental harms. The air quality in the 60s was a lot different than it is today. I mean, now there may have been other ways to achieve significant progress when it comes to air pollution, but for all it's worth, our air quality is much, much, much better than it was in the 1970s. The water is cleaner also. So, the problem is that the EPA regulates as if it's 1975 as opposed to 2025. And we have to put an end to that.
Well, I know in the, in the oil and gas industry, obviously that, you know, we have done a lot to reduce emissions and, as far as that, and I think a lot of industries have, but that's also driven up the cost of our automobiles and stuff like that, right? Because all of the equipment and the emission controls and, all of that stuff that they've regulated or required to be on a vehicle. I mean, it's driven cost up for everybody. I know, I bought a new truck this year, and I've never dreamed I would pay close to $60,000-$70,000 for a pickup truck. But I think it's a lot to do with a lot of the EPA stuff that they require on it. Is that correct?
It certainly is. And I think one thing that's important is, when we think about regulating, we think about an agency maybe imposing requirements that might drive up the cost potentially for a particular good, but it doesn't change the essence or nature of what the business is doing. The regulation now, the EPA, isn't, oh, add these pollution controls to your factory or your power plant or whatever it might be. It's, we actually don't want you to exist at all. So one way to comply with a new Biden power plant rule is, hey, one way to comply is don't exist, kill yourself off. That's not regulation at all. That nobody was thinking regulation was you can shut down. That's one way to meet the requirements. But again, and I think that's just common sense. I don't even think by this very dictionary definition of regulation would mean to effectively force something not to exist. But that's where we are. The de facto EV mandate that the EPA has pushed on the Biden administration is in essence to kill off the gas-powered car. The power plant rule is a way to kill off coal and also potentially natural gas. That's not what rules are supposed to be for. Congress never given that authority. It's again what even regulations in kind of the general sense are meant to do. So let's put some limits on what the EPA can do. That is, we can protect the environment without committing economic and social sabotage.
Yeah. I mean, as far as the EPA, I guess, when they originally started out, I'm assuming they go out and they basically contract to these scientists and they give them grants and whatever they're trying to push. And of course, they find people that are favorable so they can get a document to say, here it is. This is the reason why, we have to get rid of greenhouse gas. I mean, we got too many greenhouse gases in the country. So they don't really look at it objectively, right?
That, the first chapter of our book is all about scientific integrity. So I'm glad you brought that up. And one of the areas that of real importance is called particulate matter, and particulate matter PM 2.5, which is like fine particulate matter. Almost all the research that's out there is being kind of funded by the EPA to researchers that wind up usually sometimes being on advisory boards for the EPA. And the EPA is basically getting research that helps them make the case for the regulation. So people always want to talk about conflict of interest, but the real conflict of interest is when the regulatory agency is using science as a means to justify its own regulations. So yes, this is a big problem and something that needs to change drastically. We need to have data transparency. People should be able to access underlying data and models. The public should be able to challenge the science that's being used. We have to have protections to ensure that the agency is not cherry picking studies, that they're actually looking at studies that may say things that are not consistent with their kind of view, but that they have to be able to respond to actually their studies that may say things differently. And what we like to see is some type of process, maybe some type of hearing process of some kind, where people can challenge the science that's used in rulemaking and actually have like cross-examination and testimony, to really have like a hearing process of some type to challenge the science. Because right now the public doesn't have faith in the science the EPA is using, and nor should they.
So how did the EPA become part of the Green New Deal?
Well, the Green New Deal is kind of a way to force us away from reliable sources of electricity, um, to change how we drive our cars, what cars we drive, uh, basically to do everything in the name of climate extremism and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, no matter what the cost is to the American people. Um, a lot of the regulations that the Biden administration were promulgating were an advancement of this extreme climate agenda. The good news is the EPA, the Trump administration EPA, and Administrator Lee Zeldin is reconsidering many of these rules, and they're going to wind up, I would assume, undoing a lot of the harm that the Biden administration has done. It will still, they have to they have to do it the right way. They have to make sure they build a legal basis for it, and so that can survive in court their actions. But in so doing, they can undo a lot of the regulatory ways that, of achieving this Green New scam. Now, I think it's great that the EPA is trying to undo the Green New Deal. But in order to really address the Green New Deal, we have to also go after the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies. Because and I'm sure your viewers know about the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's probably realistically over $1 trillion worth of green subsidies in the bill, maybe even more, that try to do exactly what the regulations are trying to do, try to get people out of gas-powered cars, try to get people to not buy appliances that use natural gas, to change the way the building codes work and how we construct houses. Again, to force us into using unreliable source of electricity that will undermine our grid. Basically, everything that will undo kind of what's so important to us, which is energy, which is basically input to everything. And if you don't go after and repeal the IRA subsidies, then I don't think you can say you've ended the Green New Deal. So it's critical that we do that. And it's also critical that the EPA does what it's doing. And to their credit and to Lee Zeldin's credit, the administrator of the EPA, he's definitely trying to do his part.
So is the EPA another one of these big departments that have hundreds and hundreds of employees that they like bureaucrats?
Oh, it is plenty of bureaucrats. The agency is a little different. It's not like it's massive in terms of size and money as you necessarily would think, but that kind of is misleading because in terms, like I say, of regulatory effect, it is over half the regulatory costs come from the EPA. So they're in the regulation business of the EPA. That's what they do. That's why when there's this greenhouse gas reduction fund at the IRA, this $27 billion money that the EPA was just throwing out the door, and throwing, as one former Biden official said, they're throwing gold bars off the Titanic. They're not in the grant business. They shouldn't be. And they're really about regulation. And that's fine so long as they're trying to protect our environment as they're trying to control our economy.
So when the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, I'm sure it may have had a couple of good things in there, but for the most part, I mean, it was just a boondoggle to siphon taxpayer dollars off to, their political friends, right? Because I read recently or heard on the news that, for example, Stacey Abrams, I mean, she got like $2 billion or was going to get $2 billion. And of course, Lee Zeldin came out and said they were able to, stop $20 billion or trying to.
Yeah.
I mean, so in the end, I mean, it was just a big boondoggle, right? To take
I think you're too nice about the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't know that there's anything good about it. Even the name of the bill is bad. It has nothing to do with inflation reduction. So I mean, they couldn't even be honest about the name of the bill. So no, I don't have anything positive to say about the entire bill. But on the green stuff, because a big part of it is I put green in air quotes, okay? So,
Right.
Yeah, so here at CEI, we've been talking about this greenhouse gas reduction fund for a while. And it basically is $27 billion. It was basically it's a slush fund for the EPA. But worse, it was a slush fund the EPA has to then give money to nonprofits that are pass-through entities who then basically have their own little slush fund to give money to other people. That's what so the $20 billion that's being discussed is part of this greenhouse gas reduction fund. It's a slush fund. When you have slush funds, it's going to be prone to waste, abuse, and cronyism. So that's what we're seeing. And then the Biden administration had until September 30th, 2024 to get all this money out the door with very little protections in place. And they just started they're shoveling the money out. And, rightfully the EPA, the Trump EPA is making sure everything was above board. And I think, not surprisingly, it may not have been, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. But they should be looking at it and making sure that the grants were awarded properly, that the Biden administration created programs consistent with the statute.
So is the EPA the agency that decided to create the EV mandate, or was that done by another group?
No, it's the EPA created the de facto EV mandate. Now, there are different ways, again, that the government, and that's federal and states actually, are trying to kill off your gas powered cars. California is trying to kill off, California is killing off gas powered car.
Yeah.
And so the way it works is that the EPA can developing its own little de facto EV mandate. And then there's another way that California, what it does is it can get an exception under the Clean Air Act to exceed federal standards. So California, literally, it's not a de facto mandate. They're banning the sale of new cars by 2035. So when California gets approval from the EPA, and the Biden administration gave approval to Biden EPA gave approval to California to go forward with their ban of cars, then first of all, the manufacturers would wind up making cars consistent with the California standards. That could have effect of being ultimately a national standard just because California creates it. But in the Clean Air Act, other states can adopt California standard once the approval has been granted. So one thing that's going to be really important for everybody to pay attention to is this waiver to California to be able to push forward with their ban on cars. This is subject to what's called a Congressional Review Act resolution, the Congressional Review Act, and there's going to be an effort by Congress to vote on a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval, basically rejecting the Biden administration's granting of the California waiver. This is critical. It's really critical because if it's not done, the implication is maybe California winds up effectively forcing this effort to kill off the car. California by itself could lead to that result. So it's important that Congress pass the CRA resolution of disapproval.
Yeah, it like you were saying, it's good to talk about all this stuff, but until Congress gets up and starts rewriting some of the laws or passing laws to get rid of these crazy bills, that it doesn't really matter, right? Because you get another administration, they're going to come back in and say, we're going to do it all over again.
That's why we really focused on Congress in this effort that we're doing with the EPA project, this modernized EPA, is that to have lasting change, you need to go after the statutes, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and other statutes. On the Congressional Review Act resolution, one of the good things about it is you don't have to deal with the filibuster in the Senate. So there is a real chance that it can pass. But, we just have to make sure that Congress has the will to get rid of this kind of decision by the EPA to give California this waiver.
Do you think they have the will to do that?
I think so. I do think that it's going to be close, but I think they do. But I think we have to be on it, and we have to stay on it, communicate how important this is. And I think that I think it's distinctly possible that they can get it through.
Well, Daren, it was sure great to have you on the show today. Can you tell our listeners how to follow you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. First of all, it's great to be on the show. You can visit CEI, Competitive Enterprise Institute, at cei.org. You can see all the great work CEI is doing, including our energy environment team. And also, you can visit our website to learn more about modernizing the EPA. And if you want to, we're looking for people to join us in the fight to amend these laws so we can change the EPA. So we welcome any support out there.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Great having you on again.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.